Today I'm going to be speaking about ideas, namely the ideas of Karl Marx, the man who first discovered the philosophical ideas of Marxism, obviously. And it might seem like the study of ideas is not that important, as these ideas might seem like they have nothing to do with the issues at hand, and that our time might be better spent dealing with movements in front of us rather than discussing seemingly abstract concepts. However, ideas for us as Marxists are incredibly important, and for a few reasons. One being we're trying to change the world. So because of this, philosophy also becomes incredibly important. And if philosophy is connected to the material conditions of society, to the experiences of human beings, philosophy holds the power to give us a better understanding of what's really going on, and most importantly, what we can do about it. So the idea that we, as workers, have the ability to abolish capitalism and to transform society along socialist lines is rooted in philosophy. So basically, in order to change the world, you have to have ideas, and we would prefer to have the right ones. So if armed with the right ideas, we have the capacity to end capitalism and oppression, control our own fate as human beings, and have a deeper and better understanding of the world around us. So this is our hope as Marxists, and this is why philosophy is of incredible significance for those hoping to interpret society and those who hope to change it. So to get more into what Marxist philosophy actually is, Marxism, to speak more generally, is divided up into categories. So there's philosophy, dialectical materialism, there is the Marxist conception of history, historical materialism, and there's Marxist economics. And luckily for you guys, I will not be going too much into that today. Anyway, Marxism began as a philosophy, and in order for us to have a full understanding of the ideas of Marx, we have to explore dialectical materialism. However, Marx's ideas did not fall from the sky, fully formed, ready for him to take into the movement. The ideas of Marxist philosophy are intimately bound up not only with the trajectory of human history, but also of human thought, and all previously existing great philosophical traditions, trends, and discoveries. The history of philosophy thus far culminates in dialectical materialism, and the method of dialectical materialism, I think, completes philosophy. Philosophy, as what it was previously understood as, comes to an end with Marxism. So what I mean by that is philosophy ceases to be a system with dialectical materialism, and instead it becomes a method. It becomes not just an idle occupation of the ivory tower. So Marxism is a rigorous study of human life and society. And with Marx, philosophy becomes a guide towards action to transform society. So it builds upon all pre-existing philosophical theories, taking their best aspects and discarding the worst aspects through a scientific study of human society and the natural world, and is continuously applicable as a theoretical guide to our actions. And often, anyone in academia will hear this. You get this idea that like all the old ideas are bad, and what we really need are new ideas, that Marxism is outdated, that dialectical materialism is too dogmatic and doesn't take into consideration how complex the world really is. However, in reality, most contemporary attempts within academia to invent new ideas have really only managed to repackage subjective idealism into some radical-sounding rhetoric. And we often hear people who have never read a word of Marx and Engels laying out their criticisms of Marxism, which are usually reducible to some variation of human nature. But the reality of the situation is that Marxism is the only philosophical method that has stood the test of time, and the only philosophy that still strikes fear in the heart of the ruling class, and the only philosophy which is completely relevant to today's material conditions, despite the, like 170 years since the ideas were first developed. And this is because it describes the exploitative system of capitalism, which still exists, and explains that the only way to end capitalism is by a socialist revolution led by the working class, because they are the only class capable of wielding and running the means of production. So as I said before, Marxist philosophy is kind of inseparable from the trajectory of the history of philosophy. Learning about the development of Marxist philosophy requires a brief inquiry into the history of philosophy. as brief as that can be. And I'm not going to get into everything, obviously, but for this presentation, I hope to outline some major philosophical trends which were hugely influential in the development of the dialectical and materialist traditions. And I think in doing so, I'm able to give you a good outline of Marxist philosophy itself, because it is through this dialectical interplay of the philosophical ideas of society that Marxism is able to define itself. So Marx himself, as well as all Marxists that came after, took philosophy extremely seriously, and they were consistently reading and analyzing philosophical texts from a Marxist perspective. So I will do my best to summarize this. And we can begin with dialectics. So dialectics is a method of thought originating in ancient Greece. And dialectics is a dynamic view of nature that understands contradiction as being at the root of everything, and understands that while our knowledge is derived from sense perception, this really only tells us part of the story. So the philosophers and thinkers of the ancient world, pre-Socrates, had a natural understanding of dialectics, and most were, in fact, born dialecticians. And I think this is because contradiction is really something that's observable in every form in nature, and in fact, it forms the basis of all movement and change. So the world is not static and unchanging, but rather is constantly transforming and going into itself and becoming its opposite. Dialectical thinking was actually the primary mode of thought for thousands of years, before the development of formal logic, or common sense, the idea that the world is unchanging and has always been the way that it is now, which marks the Christian worldview that's been upheld for millennia in the West. For example, our senses might tell us that empirically, the world must be flat because it appears to be flat when we look out at the ocean or from a high mountain or a high hilltop. However, dialectics shows us that things may not always be exactly as they appear to us. And even things which are true are part of a greater whole, which may render the original truth something else entirely. So the term dialectics comes from the Greek dialektike, derived from dialogimai. I don't know if I'm saying these right. I don't speak ancient Greek. And these terms basically mean to discuss. So dialectics, in its original form, meant the art of discussion, which I think, if anyone here has studied philosophy in school, will recognize as the Socratic method of dialogue from books like The Republic. So dialectics meant to the ancient Greeks the method of beginning with a particular idea or opinion, usually derived from sense experiences about everyday life. And it is also not by accident that this dialectical method came about in ancient Greece, and this is because of the nature of democracy in ancient Athens. There was ample scope for oration and debate within their public assemblies, and in addition, philosophy arose during the slave mode of production. More generally, because it was actually slavery that allowed for a small portion of humanity to break out of manual labor into mental labor, into the realm of abstraction and generalization. So this was the beginning of philosophy. So in ancient Athens, Socrates would, using this rigorous argumentative style, expose all the contradictions of the first person's opinion. He would show the limitations and would usually make a different idea seem more correct, thereby bringing the discussion to a higher level, and this was in order to have a better understanding of the matter at hand. And the dialectic didn't mean that the two sides agreed with each other. However, within the development of the discussion itself, understanding of either side would hopefully be deepened, and both sides could take on a more correct view. So, for example, Socrates loved to ponder questions such as, what is the good? Or what is justice? And he would just go around Athens interrogating the sophists, who are professional philosophers for hire, about their views on these subjects. And we also have some earlier ancient Greek forms of dialectics, such as the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who wrote that, and I'm quoting him, there's not much that's left of his work, but he said, fire lives the death of air, and air lives the death of fire. Water lives the death of earth, earth that of water. It is the same thing in us that is living and dead, asleep and awake, young and old. Each changes place and becomes the other. We step and do not step into the same stream. We are and we are not. So here we can see this constant state of flux being described in nature. And these early dialecticians pointed out one of the most fundamental truths in the universe, that it's based upon contradiction. It is through what is not that we define what is. opposites are deeply connected and interdependent. So the easiest way to understand dialectics, I know this is very abstract, is basically through the phrase, everything changes. However, many of these ancient dialecticians that I've been discussing became shipwrecked by their material conditions. They became stuck in the realm of philosophical idealism. So they set up the basis for scientific inquiry and the dialectical method, yet because of the economic limitations of ancient society, they didn't have the ability to work out these ideas to their logical conclusion, nor apply them to human society in really any worked out form. So they ended up kind of becoming more idealist. And idealism sees the idea or the mind as the most fundamental thing in reality, and posits that the ideas take on a form of their own, beyond that of matter in the material world. So while Plato and Socrates developed the dialectical method of argumentation, their philosophy also held the idealist conception of perfect forms. So basically, there was this idea of the good or the world of forms, wherein a circle that was the perfect circle would exist, and every circle on earth is an imperfect version of that. And this opened up Plato's philosophy to religious interpretations, because the world of forms sounded a lot like God. Basically something immaterial beyond our conception, from which all matter emanates from. And while it was correct to see the importance of going from the particular to the general, his hamartia was in many ways the fact that he believed generalizations of the intellect could stand alone, divorced from the world. So in many ways, Plato sought to observe the world not as it was, but as it ought to be. However, as Marxists, we have to point out that there is no ideal form of anything, because the world constantly changes, and this is the nature of evolution. And there's one more Greek philosopher who is foundational to Marxism before I get away from Greece. So his name was Aristotle. And Aristotle was also highly foundational to Hegel, whose philosophy Marx would then go on to develop, and I will go into that later. But Aristotle was also a dialectical philosopher. However, he still had elements of idealism, which held back his method from fully expressing its conclusions. So Aristotle came to most of his conclusions through concrete facts of sense perception, and from those facts arose at general facts and principles. And he disagreed with Plato on the world of forms. And I have a very funny quote by Aristotle about world of forms, where he says, "It is a puzzle to know what the weaver or carpenter will gain for his own craft from knowing this good itself, or how anyone will be better at medicine or generalship from having gazed on the idea itself." I think he makes a good point. So for Aristotle, knowing the good was a material question, not an ideal abstraction. And he's also credited for discovering the laws of formal logic, which he saw as complementing dialectics. So Aristotle sought to develop generalized axioms, basically like rules to avoid absurd contradictions. However, these laws kind of end up only being true in certain situations. So the three laws are as follows. One, the law of identity, that A equals A, so a thing is equal to itself. Number two, the law of contradiction, A is not A. And then three, the law of the excluded middle, so A is not B at the same time. So the development of the laws of formal logic was very important. And it's true that formal logic does hold true, things are things, especially during everyday interactions. Like a chair is a chair, a pencil is a pencil, I am who I am, I guess, However, these formal laws are incapable of dealing with motion, as everything is in a constant state of flux, meaning that the law of identity is only ever really an approximation. So the nature of reality is a contradiction, and it's impossible to break down everything in existence into formal laws of identity, as if positive and negative necessarily exclude each other and cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis to each other, as Engels wrote in Anti-Düring. So things are much more interconnected and oppositional than formal logic might seem, and at a certain point, these laws begin to break down. So Engels explains this in Anti-Düring, writing, "They have cudgeled their brains in vain, trying to discover a rational limit beyond which the killing of a child in its mother's womb is murder. It is just as impossible to determine absolutely the moment of death, for physiology proves that death is not an instantaneous, momentary phenomenon, but a very protracted process." This quote is also interesting because it shows that the abortion debate was happening 170 years ago. So that's interesting too. But anyway, in addition to this, A is really only equal to A in a general sense. And the closer that we begin to look at each of the two letters, as if through a microscope, the more different A and A really appear from each other. So Leon Trotsky describes this in the ABC of materialist dialectics, where he writes that, in reality, a pound of sugar is never equal to a pound of sugar. A more delicate scale always discloses the difference. Again, one can object, but a pound of sugar is equal to itself. Neither is this true. All bodies change uninterruptedly in size, weight, color, etc. They're never equal to themselves. So what he means by this is that, no thing is equal to itself, because in motion things change, and no two equal things are really equal. And I know this is probably really abstract, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this. And at a certain point of tolerance, the similarity of these things reaches a critical difference wherein they become another thing altogether. So generally speaking, for most ordinary daily life things, the laws of formal logic hold up just fine. But once we start applying them to things like morality, or freedom, or human nature, or even capitalism, it becomes impossible to see them as fixed abstractions, devoid of material conditions. So formal logic is the philosophy of capitalism, which is reflected in common statements that we hear like, things will never change, there'll never be a revolution, or capitalism is the best system, or even, I'm sure we've all heard this, socialism has failed every time it's been tried, which failed to grasp the transformative and changing nature of society. So we can see here the utility of formal logic, and also their downfall, and why a dialectical understanding of logic is necessary to grasp this, the transformative nature of the world and human society. And within Aristotle, we also find the embryo of a materialist conception of history, despite how he wavered between materialism and idealism. But I think his biggest weakness was in his understanding of the unmoved first mover, so basically his conception of God. Despite the fact that Aristotle did believe the universe was infinite and never-ending, he still thought there had to be a first cause from which all motion originated. So similarly to Plato, while he didn't call it God, a conception of the first cause opens up religious interpretations. And it also contradicts the dialectical understanding of motion, because how can an immaterial mover imbue motion upon a material universe? Where does that immateriality come from, and where does it reside? So from here, Aristotle ended up in a teleological conception of nature, mainly because of this search for causes in everything, and the idea that if there's a first cause, there has to be a final cause towards which everything in nature is determined. And again, that leads us to religious conclusions, because usually we will see this determining factor as proof of God. So despite the brilliant and important parts of Aristotle's philosophy, his ideas ended up being co-opted by Christianity and through the works of Aquinas and Duns Scotus, and they end up characterizing kind of this Aristotelian medieval world outlook that took hold for a millennium. So anyway, I've gone into a lot of detail about dialectics, never want to say the word again. However, I've really only hinted at materialism, which is the other half of dialectical materialism, because it's not enough to just be things change. That's what are you saying there? So Marxism is a materialist philosophy because it asserts that all that exists does so materially. There is no substance other than what exists in matter, and mind is an extension of matter. So in developing Marxist materialism, Marx built upon previous forms of philosophical materialism, namely that built by the English empiricist tradition in the Renaissance and early modern period, and this was an incredibly revolutionary period. These thinkers included people like Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, all of whom who can be credited with beginning the empirical method of seeking an understanding of the world through our senses, rather than seeing the world as representations of perfect forms. However, this was done in kind of a crude and mechanistic way. So in trying to divorce philosophy from religion, they were also bringing back induction and empiricism back to philosophy. They took a very, very mechanistic view. So for example, Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, "For seeing life is but a motion of limbs. For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many springs, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body." So that's literally the body's a machine, and you can really see this mechanistic materialist view of nature. So Hobbes is on the right track, but he fails to see the dynamism of life in his materialist conception of history. Or I guess materialist conception of the body, sorry. So basically, in refuting idealism, these materialists brought mind from the heavens down to earth, and then just kept going. So it makes sense that It does make sense, though, that philosophy during this time was mechanistic. This was the dawn of modern science, and many people were realizing just how complicated the world really was and how insignificant we were in it. So during the Renaissance, the British empiricist movement demonstrated a step forward. However, later, However, later in the 17th and 18th centuries, it became increasingly divorced from reality. Or as Marx put it became increasingly one-sided. So this represented how, at least in England, the revolutionary age was past. The bourgeoisie had thoroughly ascended as the ruling class of British society, and the philosophical outlook became increasingly narrow and conservative. So two examples of this can be represented in the philosophies of David Hume and Bishop George Berkeley. So Bishop Berkeley, if you've studied philosophy, you probably know who he is. He was very religious, and he completely opposed materialism for what he saw as the dangerous role that it played in weakening religion. And he became dead set on disproving materialism, and ended up having to disprove that the world existed really at all. So he took the weakness of mechanical materialism and turned it into its opposite. So essentially asserting that because all we knew was because of sense perception, we therefore can't prove that anything exists independently of our senses. So he claimed that to exist is to be perceived, meaning that if something isn't being perceived, then it doesn't exist. And he also said that to have an idea is the same as to perceive, meaning that mind is the only fundamental substance in the universe. Everything else is immaterial, everything is mind. And they use this argument to try and prove that nothing exists except for in the mind that perceives them. There's no objective material reality, and this is subjective idealism. This idea that we can't know anything except for our own lived experiences, and that the objective world is unknowable because there are too many subjective interpretations of it. With subjective idealism, reality then becomes nothing more than the ideas one may have about it, since you can't disprove what someone else says their perception is. So Berkeley claimed the reason why we perceive consistency in the world, which is obviously a contradiction to his philosophy, is because of God. That God wills the senses into us and provides us with some degree of universal conformity. Berkeley writes, "This consistent, uniform working obviously displays the goodness and wisdom of God, the governing spirit whose will constitutes the laws of nature." So he got out of that one somehow. But basically, through the work of God, who's this omnipotent, spirited being, human beings are able to make sense of the world, which otherwise they would be unable to do, because everything is just like so subjective. So God is basically choosing what we are allowed to perceive. Obviously, this is not the case. In reality, our senses and our bodies arose through evolution, and obviously, if human beings didn't exist, the world would still exist, just as it did for billions of years before we existed. So empiricism finally came to a theoretical end with David Hume, who argued that basically nothing exists because of anything else, and causation is not real. He argued that cause and effect are just like habit. Like the only reason we think that things are going to happen is because they've happened before. And like Hume is obviously a big name in philosophy, but like this is actually what he thought. I was surprised. So for example, Hume would argue that there is no logical or cause and effect related reason why the sun comes up in the morning. We just like are used to that happening. Or he would argue this is like there's no logical reason why the light turns on when you press the switch. I mean, light switches didn't exist during his time, but you get what I mean. And he said it's just completely illogical to try to find explanations for anything in nature, and everything is just a bunch of random, unconnected events that are just following one another. But here I think we can really see the problem of mechanical materialism and empiricism, because it only asserts one side of the equation. And then it can be made to assert absurd conclusions like the ones I just mentioned. So this is why, as Marxists, while we understand the importance of taking a materialist viewpoint of history, society, and nature, we also have to be dialectical. We need to understand the complexity and the flux of the universe, not just how it appears to be at one given instance or another. And while it's true that everything changes, and many things are complicated, viewing events as random and unconnected can lead to incoherent conclusions, and can lead us to being unable to understand society. And it's important to mention that while English materialism was kind of just shipwrecked with Hume, Marx was heavily inspired by French materialism, which in the 18th century was in the midst of its most revolutionary epoch. So the Russian Marxist Georgy Plekhanov wrote that 18th century materialist philosophy, specifically French, was the ideological expression of the revolutionary bourgeois struggle against the clergy, the nobility, and the absolute monarchy. So the French materialists, such as Diderot, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and even Rousseau, denounced the church and feudal oppression, and they laid the basis for socialist and communist conclusions because of their assertion of the equality of human beings. That for humanity's true nature to be actualized, the world must be organized in such a way as to impress those values onto them. These tasks, however, could not be completed by the limits of bourgeois society, which requires inequality and exploitation. This would require the overthrow of capitalism and class society as a whole. And this is as Marx and Engels put it in The Holy Family. I'm quoting, "If correctly understood, interest is the principle of all morality. Man's private interest must be made to coincide with the interest of humanity. If man is unfree in the materialist sense, crime must not be punished in the individual, but the anti-social sources of crime must be destroyed, and each man must be given social scope for the vital manifestation of his being. If man is shaped by environment, his environment must be made human. If man is shaped by nature, he will develop his true nature only in society, and the power of his nature must be measured not by the power of the separate individuals, but by the power of society." So we can really see here how Marx and Engels were inspired by the radical philosophers of the French materialist tradition. However, those thinkers were held back by their material conditions because they didn't yet have the capacity to look towards socialism. The working class didn't really exist yet, and that would require at least another century of capitalist development. So for a long time, materialism was a dead end in philosophy, basically other than was put forward by the French materialists. And no one did anything with that until Marx in the 19th century, which I promise I will get to soon. In fact, for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the greatest discoveries and greatest philosophers were in the realm of philosophical idealism, because they weren't restricted by this kind of strict mechanistic, empiricist, and dogmatic scientist models, which characterized most conceptions of materialism at the time. So many of the philosophers that we categorize as idealists, such as Spinoza and Kant and Leibniz, I can't really speak about too much, made incredible discoveries in science through reason alone, and this was given the very limited scientific studies and results available to them at the time. For example, Spinoza's conception of mind and matter as one substance, monism, was fundamental to Marx and Engels, who placed monism on a material basis. And while philosophical idealism was an error, it isn't just nonsense. And Lenin explains this in his philosophical notebooks. It's really only nonsense if you refuse to consider how human knowledge develops, not in a straight line, but in a series of circles, kind of like a spiral, if you like. So this is what Lenin said. He said, "Any fragment, segment, section of this curve can be transformed one-sidedly into an independent, complete straight line, which then, if one does not see the wood for the trees, leads into the quagmire, into clerical obscurantism, like religious idealism, where it is anchored by the class interests of the ruling class." So there's still utility to studying idealism. So next I'm going to speak about Hegel. Despite Hegel's idealism, he was probably the single most revolutionary philosopher before Marx, and the first philosopher to develop a system for understanding the dialectics of history. So Marx actually began as a young Hegelian, and much of his early years were spent reading and critiquing Hegel. And we can very much see Marx's historical and dialectical materialism within Hegel's philosophy, albeit in a completely mystical form. So according to Hegel, every single thing we do as human beings, acting throughout our own perceived free will, is a historical act as we barrel unconsciously towards the realization of freedom through reason and unreason. However, as individuals, we don't act alone. We don't act alone as individuals within history. So Hegel explains in his introduction to the philosophy of history that the complex making of human history, with all its trials and tribulations and triumphs, is done through the collective actions of billions of people. And he sees this as enacted through the state, which too arises out of a continual struggle for the acquisition of freedom. A struggle between two forces that Hegel calls the idea, that is absolute reason, and human passion. So this is, to Hegel, this is spirit becoming fully aware of itself. So basically, all of human, I feel like I'm saying basically a lot, I apologize. Human history is the dialectical interplay of logic, continually perfecting itself through human action, negating former systems of thought towards the acquisition of what Hegel called the absolute idea. So Engels describes this, writing, "From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appears as a whirlwind of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all of its devious ways, and to trace the inner law running through all of its apparently accidental phenomena." Hegel's method sought to understand history as a struggle between reason and unreason, and examine the historic necessity of ideas arising in particular ages, as well as the dialectical relationship between different schools of thought, how they all show different aspects of the truth, not in contradiction, but as complementary philosophies. So history to Hegel wasn't a collection of facts about events, but a fundamentally philosophical venture towards the full self-actualization of the spirit, like a perpetually self-negating spiral ascending towards the absolute idea. Hegel also believed that this whole process was necessary, because human history has particular stages of development through which particular ideas are made possible, meaning that all stages of society have a reason to exist, a rationale which justifies their existence. And he famously stated, "All that is real is rational, all that is rational is real," meaning that all these ideas, states, and systems come into being when they're historically necessary, and then cease to be once they are no longer historically necessary. So you can see the method here, I think, is brilliant. He developed the three laws upon which Marxism is based, which I'll talk about later. However, he made some serious mistakes in his system, or actually even the fact that it's a system is a mistake. But anyway, it's completely mystical and just contradicts dialectics. Ultimately, the real mistake is the idealism. So as Engels said to Hegel, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things and their evolution were only the realized pictures of the idea, existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. So he believed the state was the culmination of the absolute idea, and his quote about real rational can be used to basically justify any prevailing system or state, no matter how unjust or exploitative. So Hegel understood that the real could become unreal, meaning ceasing to be necessary, and thus negated by some more real, so more necessary state, making the real and rational into its opposite, unreal and irrational. So these ideas reverse the connection between ideas and things in the world. So Engels goes on to say it was suffering from an internal and incurable contradiction. Upon one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution, which by its very nature cannot find its intellectual final term in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. A system of natural and historic knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectical reasoning. The error of Hegel and his system basically is trying to finalize this fantastic dialectical method with this undialectical conclusion, the discovery of absolute truth, which, as Engels says, is only absolute insofar as he has absolutely nothing to say about it. So the problem is that the absolute idea, similar to the good in Plato's works, is just another word for God. And he also sees the main conflict in society or in history as being between ideas, whereas Marxists see it as being between classes, the exploiter and the exploited, under capitalism, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Despite the revolutionary edge to the Hegelian dialectic, Hegel himself was unable to branch out of the abstraction that is the absolute idea, because he couldn't even describe it, or say, oh, it's above my comprehension to describe. So the inability to fully grasp what he meant by the actualization of freedom, his inability to see the kernel of a higher stage of freedom that was, I guess, higher than his own, and his inability to see past his own society put him in a camp wherein, by the last analysis, he defended the state of his time, the Prussian monarchy, as he claimed it represented the seeds of the absolute idea. So in Germany, there ended up being a large following of Hegelians. And following his death, there was a split in the Hegelian school between those who liked his idealist system, who were more right-wing, and those who liked his dialectical method, who were more left-wing. So the left-wing Hegelians called themselves the young Hegelians, and we can probably guess this is where Marx came from. And as in his early years, he was a young Hegelian, and this is mainly because he was interested in that dialectical method. And as you might know, Marx was a philosopher first, and he was drawn to Hegel's idealist philosophy because it had what he called its energizing principle, which he saw as missing from materialist philosophy. And the young Hegelians were full of other philosophical thinkers, many of whom young liberals and radicals, and the Prussian state took note of this by firing all the Hegelian professors from the universities, which ruined Marx's dream of becoming a professor. Sorry to hear that, but not really. Anyway, around this time, the young Hegelians began to disintegrate because of a number of debates, mainly around the question of religion. I won't go into that now. The young Hegelians were characterized by debate, and at a certain point, the thinkers began to break from Hegel as well. And around this time, there was a young Hegelian who would become very influential to Marx, named Ludwig Feuerbach, who decided to resuscitate materialism from its Cold English coma. It was Feuerbach who, in saving materialism, killed Hegelian idealism. And in fact, he mistakenly also discarded the Hegelian dialectic too. So he did so by proclaiming that matter is an essential object for reason. If there was no matter, reason would have no stimulus, and no material for thought, and hence no content. So he destroyed the absolute idea, stating it was nothing more than believing in phantoms, and he identified that God was the creation of humankind. And Feuerbach also criticized religion because he saw it as the real source of humanity's alienation, but he did not mean to destroy religion. He actually wanted to absorb philosophy into religion, as Engels put it. So according to Feuerbach, romantic and sexual affections between human beings constituted a religion. So basically, Feuerbach thought that sex was a religion, and basically every bond between two people was a religion. Okay, so while Feuerbach tried to resuscitate materialism, he still remained shipwrecked in idealism because he saw human beings in the abstract, and he saw religion as the real antagonism in society. He also asserted that the periods of humanity are distinguished only by religious changes, which is wrong and kind of ends up just flipping the equation on its head. Lots of doing that. So in reality, religious changes accompanies great social and economic upheavals and is rooted in the transformation of the productive forces of society. Despite setting out on a materialist basis, Feuerbach was up in the clouds and his ideas never went anywhere, and he got fired from university and he died forgotten by history. So that's very sad. But Marx was actually interested in Feuerbach's ideas, although he didn't really like them very much. But because of Feuerbach, he was encouraged to pick up materialism again. He's like, if this is all there is, I gotta look at this again. So he became increasingly left-wing, and he began to oppose the authoritarian German state for suppressing free speech. And it was around this time, around 1844, that Marx met Friedrich Engels, who was developing similar ideas to Marx. So Engels would become Marx's ideological and lifelong companion who would help him develop and continue his most important philosophical, political, and economic ideas. And through his study of the material conditions of society, Marx realized that it was only through revolution that oppressive conditions could be swept away. Also, I have to drink water. I'm sorry, guys. And and who would be the one to overthrow the oppressive order? And what was the root of this oppression? So the root, Marx realized, was capitalism, and it would be the working class who would overthrow capitalism because of the nature of capitalist production, and the working class who would need to take power. So Marx and Engels, working together, transformed Hegel's dialectical laws of nature on a materialist basis in order to make them intelligible and get rid of the idealist mysticism to put them to work in the interest of the working class. So I'm going to give a brief explanation of these laws. So the first one, and these are not laws, these are scientific kind of laws. So the law of quantity into quality is the first one. And this argues that fundamental transformation occurs through many small quantitative changes, which may not be discernible in and of themselves, however will lead to explosions or jumps at a qualitative point in their development. And society has many examples of this law. As we know, a strike isn't simply about pay raises or like any other issue, but rather the accumulation of issues caused by exploitation under capitalism, which must be expressed through an ascension of the class struggle. And there are also examples of this law in nature, in evolution. whereas change occurs not in a gradual process of change, but actually through a process of punctuated equilibrium. So many small changes leading to a burst of rapid evolutionary change caused by other changes in the environment. So that's quantity into quality. The second law is the law of the unity of opposites. And this law explained how it is through opposites that we define phenomena in the world. Without dark, there is no light. Without life, there is no death. Without positive, there is no negative. They're all two sides of the same coin. And this is the paradox of existence. As soon as we're born, we start to die. In creating the proletariat, the bourgeoisie creates its own gravediggers. So in order to have a financial boom, there has to have been at one point a slump. For it to be night, we must have at one point had to have day. And so through dialectics, studying the unity of opposites, we can see how things are transient. They don't stay the same, and they can even become their opposite. According to Lenin, contradiction, paradox, this confrontation of opposites is the motor force of development. So history exists in an intense process of periods of revolution and stability, peace and revolution and counter-revolution, etc. And the last law is the law of negation of the negation. And this law shows that things transform, not in a straight, smooth line, but rather as a spiral, as Hegel wrote. As a thing evolves, it negates from the thing from which it evolves, yet brings with it the most advantageous aspects from the thing which it evolved from. So what this means is that, just to use a historical example, throughout history stages, there is the stage of pre-class society evolving into slave society, which evolved into feudal society, which birthed capitalist society, and basically this is the march of history. And not all is lost from the previous stage. Once it transforms, it's a higher level rather than an elimination. So past features may still be visible or return, but ultimately only the most evolutionarily useful parts remain. Because history learns from itself and evolves from itself, part of the previous society will always be visible in the next stage, especially at the beginning. And I hope that you can see from this presentation how much the study of philosophy itself is also a process of negation of the negation, much like the development of class society. And Marx built upon all previously existing philosophical ideas, keeping and advancing the best parts and discarding that which ultimately ended up in reactionary conclusions. And Marx also realized, I guess to move past the laws, Marx also began to realize that the revolution from this would need to be international, because the development of the capitalist system and thus the creation of the proletariat, the working class, was basically international as well. And there are a number of other thinkers that Marx was heavily influenced by, like the utopian socialists. I really can't get into them right now. However, the main difference was that they believed socialism was just a good idea, whereas Marx showed that socialism had a scientific basis, meaning there's actually a development, like society was developing towards this and made it possible, not merely good in a moral way. And this made sense why, because the previous philosophers hadn't yet considered the working class. In fact, they hadn't even met them. They didn't exist yet. So by studying the development of the working class under capitalism, Marx realized that it was within capitalism that there were seeds of the new economic system, which is socialism. And he also saw that in raising the productive forces, capitalism would actually undermine itself, making socialism a necessity for expanding the productive forces. So by setting out on a materialist basis, Marx was able to flip Hegel on his head and show that, while dialectical laws do exist in society, they're not brought about through ideas, but rather changes in the productive forces, which are then reflected in the ideas of each age. Marx was able to combine the Hegelian dialectical method, stripped of its idealism, with materialism, stripped of its vulgar metaphysics, into the philosophy which would be known as dialectical materialism. And simply put, this is the study of matter and motion, that all that exists does so material in a constant state of flux and is all interconnected and interdependent. And in this way, dialectical materialism negates the Hegelian dialectical laws by bringing them on a higher level and discarding that which was not useful, idealism. So Marx writes in the German Ideology, in direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, or from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived of, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real active men on the basis of their real-life process. We demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. In developing dialectical materialism, Marx broke with all pre-existing philosophical trends by creating what you can kind of see as a non-philosophical philosophy, because it's not a system, it's a method. And in a sense, dialectical materialism is kind of unnegatable, because if you negate dialectics, you're affirming the dialectical law of negation of the negation. So, I don't know, it's like checkmate. But anyway, by beginning with material, Marx realized that it was through human labor that society could be transformed. And it was through collective labor that we create the world. Marx traced the exploitation of one class by another through all of class society, observing that during different stages of class society, different types of enslavement and exploitation occurred, and that within that exploitation, the state of a new system existed, and that could revolutionize the productive forces. As he says in the Communist Manifesto, the history of class society is the history of class struggle. And it's not just from class society that we will be emancipated, but through class society that we will be emancipated. And the biggest change of all in Marx's philosophy was that he realized philosophy had to be more than just thinking about abstract generalizations. Philosophy was a guide to action. And he wasn't just a philosopher, he was, above all, a revolutionary. And academics might have you think that Marx just sat around reading and writing all day, but in fact, he founded the first international, or the International Working Men's Association, that was aimed at uniting all forces against capitalism, and he actively supported and participated in revolutionary movements during his life. And this is why, Marx wrote, philosophers hitherto have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. So if we are to understand society in order to change it, this can't be done arbitrarily, since the human will is not a master of nature. Rather, our ideas and our thoughts are reflections of necessary material laws, which are observable and are knowable. So what we have to do is seek to understand the laws of human society and how it changes. So that is why, hope it makes sense, as Marxists, why philosophy is incredibly important to us. And the entire history of Marxism is a philosophical debate and defense of dialectical materialism and the Marxist method. And this begins with Marx's debates with the young Hegelians, to today with our debates with, the postmodernists and other reactionary philosophical trends. So for the working class, philosophy isn't just a tool, it's a weapon that tells the capitalists, we know the world doesn't have to be this way. We know we can overthrow you, and we know how. We have to organize. And I'm kind of reminded here of the quote by the author Ursula Le Guin when she wrote, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And to this day, the Communist Manifesto and the ideas of Marxism are incredibly relevant, and even more so than they were when they were written. And if they weren't, I don't think that we would be here right now studying these ideas and learning how to overthrow capitalism. And while a lot has changed since Marx's time, we are still dealing with the same fundamental antagonism between the bosses and the workers. So our goal as Marxists is to overthrow capitalism in a socialist revolution and replace the anarchic capitalist economy with one that is actually run democratically by the working class for human need rather than profit. And we as Marxists fight for the socialist transformation of society on an international world historical scale. So if we want to win, we have to have the right ideas, and we have to have the strength to fight for our ideas. So to everyone here who opposes capitalism and believes that a better world is possible, please get organized, help us build, and join us in the struggle for the liberation of humanity from capitalism.